It is my pleasure to introduce, with very few words, Yuri Goren of argmax, who's going to talk about personas, something some of you have heard me go on and on and on about. Yuri, take it away.
Thank you so much, David. And thank you so much for attending this talk. I know that persona is kind of a loaded term these days. We're going to discuss how we can use LLMs and persona-based simulation to optimize our search. But first, let's start with a short motivation why you guys should actually care about it. So, for the people listening online in a year from now, the year today is 2025, and 2024 was supposed to be the year of RAG. This is not our slide, I've taken it from OpenAI and customgpt.ai. So 2024 was the year of RAG, and we at argmax developed a lot of chatbots. If there's one thing that I keep telling our potential prospects, the humanity does not need more chatbots, right? So we kind of discovered that RAG, retrieval augmented generation, is really tricky to get right. And the reason usually is that our thing, right, the retrieval system, or in other words, search. So generation works pretty well. We get huge models, really good models. But at the end of the day, if we feed it the wrong data, then you can't really recover from that. So retrieval augmented generation is essentially trying to use retrieval systems to optimize search. And we think we should really go the other way around. So if you want to improve your chatbot or your GenAI application, you probably want to improve the search first. So this is kind of a chat interface like, hey, can you help me improve my search system? Yes, you are correct. Certainly, if you got a chance to chat with Claude or ChatGPT, they're pretty convincing. So this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to use GenAI backwards, so kind of the opposite of RAG, using GenAI to optimize retrieval. So this is our agenda for today. It's scheduled for 45 minutes, but hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions. First of all, a few words about me and argmax. Then we'll talk about how we can improve search with GenAI. Then we're going to talk about the main topic, how we can measure chat, and we can measure search with tools like ChatGPT, LLMs. And then we'll finish up with kind of a philosophical debate, like what are we trying to measure, what's the hidden state of search, and what does the future look like. And I guess that we'll have plenty of time to do some Q&A. So let's start. First of all, while I used a lot of AI in this presentation, I'm a human. So I have 3 children. The newborn is Liv. She was born here. And I moved to the States roughly 1 year ago. I'm originally from Israel, in case you missed the very thick accent. I started my way working at Microsoft, developing computer vision algorithms for the Kinect. It was like prehistoric times, like before deep learning, computer vision of before deep learning. Yeah, kind of weird today. Then I gradually moved to AT&T, working on customer support data, and this was my segue into natural language processing. Then I used to work also for Yahoo, working on Yahoo Mail and native ads, until eventually I co-founded Best Practice, which is a legal tech startup trying to shorten the drafting stage, doing legal work. That was eventually acquired in 2020. And in 2020, I founded argmax. argmax is a company helping other companies do search and recommendation. So I guess that all of you can probably relate. On my free time, I co-host PyData, which is a Python data science community, both in New York and in Israel. And I have a podcast called Explainable, in which we kind of translate the latest in machine learning and AI to Hebrew. this is a partial list of our clients. We partnered with quite a lot of industry leaders like AWS OpenSearch, Redis, and Hyperspace, which actually talked, I think, last year or the year before here on this venue. This is actually my second time here. I really like this venue. And now that we're done with the intros, let's talk about search and why we actually care about search and why we think that there's a lot of opportunity for improvement with AI. So this is how a search indexing pipeline looked for the last, I don't know, 10, 20 years. So this is kind of a gross simplification, but essentially we have a knowledge base. It could be a blog, it could be a Wikipedia page, it could be an e-commerce store, from which we derive our items, and we do a lot of fancy pre-processing. We tokenize them, bigrams, trigrams, we add some classification, metadata, but at the end of the day, we take the data that we have, blog posts or articles, items, and we process them into documents. Each document is getting embedded, and I don't mean only deep learning embeddings. For the sake of the arguments, also BN25 or OneHot is also some sort of vectorization. And we get a list of vectors, and we push them into a vector database. Again, for the sake of the argument, Elasticsearch, OpenSearch are also vector database, whether if the vectors are dense or sparse. This is how the classical pipeline looks. And after 2023, where ChatGPT really came to be used everywhere, I think that the most trivial way to plug it in is to use an LLM like ChatGPT in the pre-processing pipeline, meaning that we still have the same data pieces, the same paragraphs, the same articles, items, but now we use ChatGPT to ask a list of questions about them. Like, is this product suitable for young adults? Is this product helpful for headaches, etc.? And we have a lot of other metadata fields that we extracted and enriched with an LLM. So essentially now we have a list of documents and answers. We embed them together, and again, I'm grossly oversimplifying the pipeline. And now our search is supposed to be better. What we found to be even more useful is to use the HYDE architecture. HYDE stands for Hypothetical Document Embedding. This is a really interesting paper that I think is kind of underrated. I think that every search system should kind of be inspired by HYDE. And the main idea here is that we kind of reverse the two stages. Instead of asking an LLM like ChatGPT to answer questions about a document, we use an LLM to ask questions about the document or some sort of chunks of the document. So what we get here is that each document is now being processed into several questions, and we actually index the questions and not the answers. Now, while that seems kind of weird, it's actually very helpful. One of the main advantages of using this approach is that we can bridge the language gap. So this is actually an example taken from one of our real customers. It's a hospital chain we're working for. And people tend to use different language than the medical language that we see on real blog posts. So for example, here you see an example of someone suffering from jaundice. Jaundice, put in simple words, is having yellow skin or yellow eyes. It can indicate a lot of very complicated things, or it could be nothing. Right? So it's pretty common search term, but people don't search for jaundice. Actually, people who do search for jaundice are actually worried, more concerned about newborn jaundice, but a lot of people just have a yellowish tan. So we're trying to bridge that gap between the query like, hey, I have yellow eyes or yellow skin, and that piece of content that doesn't even mention that phrase. And HYDE does really good work, really good job bridging that gap, right? I'm asking an LLM to ask questions about that article, and we get a lot of different phrasing that's actually pretty useful. Um, so a bit of a note about using an LLM in the Hyde architecture. We want it to be diverse. Unlike using ChatGPT that can be very verbose and very accurate, here we want to have very short queries like a user would ask. And we want the temperature to be relatively higher than usual because we want a diversity. People can rephrase the question in a lot of different ways, and we do have an option to control for that with the API. So that's like kind of tips and tricks on how to use an LLM with the Hyde architecture. So we're trying to kind of build on top of the motivation of hypotheticals, and let's see how that plays in to the evaluation pipeline. So first of all, there are two ways to evaluate any kind of system, either the online, that requires a lot of people, a real audience, or offline, which does not, and hopefully could be automized. Let's start with a quick refresher on A/B testing. And A/B testing is generally, I think that the classic example is like you design a landing page and you have a lot of colors and you should decide what is the best color for the call to action button or what image should you put. It's actually a bit more complicated in search, and we'll describe in a second why is that. But essentially, if we have a large audience, we can split it evenly or not evenly. We're going to randomly assign each individual to one of two buckets, bucket A or bucket B. Each bucket is going to have a different treatment, and a treatment in our case is going to be a different search algorithm. It could be a new algorithm at all, or it could be just a different configuration of Elasticsearch or OpenSearch. But in any case, we want to change each variant, to assign each variant to a different proportion of the audience, and then we'll need to measure the impact. And that's actually the tricky part, because there are a lot of ways to measure search. Just to name a few, DCG, the average rank, maybe we're actually trying to measure revenue, right? That's actually what clients care about. Or the session length. Should the session length be long or short? It really depends on the client. So that's actually the tricky part where most of our clients kind of ended up being confused. And you have fancy dashboards like these showing the average rank per day and how the coverage distribution. And it's really hard to reason about. So when you have so many different KPIs and most of them not really have anything to do with the bottom line, with the revenue, so it's really hard to communicate that, especially to people, to product people and people who do not do search for a living. Usually we see clients trying to have some sort of I don't know, a hybrid, some sort of a weighted average, trying to weigh what is the miss rate times 20% plus the average rank divided. So they try to come up with their own formula, which is helpful because you only have one KPI to look at. But it's also kind of weird and from customer to customer basis. So we kind of discovered that measuring search and communicating it to the end client is tricky. Plus, if you kind of add on top of it all of the usual things that can go wrong with online testing, first of all, it's expensive, right? If you have two variants, one of them is going to underperform, so you're wasting a lot of potential revenue. You have all of the classical problems with A/B testing, like potential split ratio mismatch, and it's really complicated to get an online experiment done correctly. But I think that the bottom line is that any online experiment cannot be automated. So it slows down the entire pace of improving our insight search. I think that one thing that is very specific to search is that in search, unlike choosing the right color for a button, the user has some sort of a hidden intent. For example, these are two hypothetical peoples. We have, I don't know, John and Sally here. Both of them type the query with the word headache. One of them is suffering from migraines, the other has some sort of muscle pain, neck pain. They're going to get the same result theoretically because it's the same query, but they have different intentions. So that's tricky because that's like a hidden variable that we do not have the opportunity to observe. So if you try to measure the system as a whole and look at like the average rank of a click or NDCG, it's really hard to distinguish those two identities. In practice, what we actually try to do is we try to reason about a session and not a specific search. So I've seen a lot of work being trying to predict what would be the next query and to have some sort of, I don't know, hybrid metrics for the entire search session, which makes things even more complicated, right? We have various session length. It's really hard to measure all of this. But what if we can actually try and reason about it from the user intentions point of view? So let's assume, for the sake of the argument, that a user is thinking about a specific item in the catalog. For example, this hypothetical user is thinking about the ice cream cone. Now, she may come up with several queries, but she has this intention. So she knows exactly what she's looking for, and she's trying to use the right words to come up with the right query. Now, we know exactly the user intention. We have the query that we can generate, and we can measure our search system against that user-specific intent. This is how we think LLM and GenAI in general actually come into play. We define several personas. Each persona can kind of reason about different parts or modalities of the item. For example, some people are more visual. They can think about, I don't recall the name of the item, but I recall that it was blue, right? So we can use GenAI to actually generate these queries and to measure against the specific user intents with the different modalities. We come up with several, these are like 3 sample personas. There are a lot of parameters you can control for when you're kind of engineering a persona. Just to name a few. So first of all, the prompt, right? The prompt is kind of the context. And this is actually an opportunity to kind of plug in some information about your target audience. For example, you can start a prompt like with, you're a 20-year-old woman who likes, I don't know, whatever. So it's a really good opportunity to give the LLM some more context regarding your target audience. The objective. Are you trying to summarize? Are you trying to describe? Are you trying to come up with synonyms? And obviously, what are you looking at? The categories, the title, the image, the video. And this is actually a good opportunity to use other modalities, right? Image, video, audio, which we didn't have a really neat way to do out of the box before GenAI. So now we have everything in place. We have a user, we have a target item that the user is thinking about. We have our search system. The user comes up with a query using GenAI. We're going to trigger our search system, and then we can measure in what percentage of the cases the result set contained the target item. We ended up getting a dashboard like this. This is only like 3 sample personas, but it's way easier to reason about. Like, given this target audience, people of certain age, people of certain demographic, this is how our offline simulations behave, and we can fully automate it. We can run like 1,000 simulations like every hour. There isn't a real limitation. We're only scraping the surface regarding user intentions. So let's try and even dig a bit deeper. Let's assume that we have that same user who's having back pain or neck pain while she's actually typing her query, this is a good opportunity to kind of poke around and see what items in our catalog are actually relevant to her. So auto-suggest or auto-completion are not new things, but with GenAI, we can actually kind of guide the user towards where we have items that are relevant for her. We also used personas to write hypothetical questions, and this is a good opportunity. We can prepare it in advance. We're not triggering the LLM on query time, kind of make a list of possible questions before, and we find it to be really, really useful. And same goes here, right? Some people are more visual, right? You can describe this weird jelly blue pill or any other kind of blue pill, and you'll get the results. And we find it to be like a really game changer for auto-completion. I guess that if I had to kind of summarize, so we got a lot of capabilities with personas and GenAI that we didn't have before. We can reason about different modalities. We can plug in some more context. And this is a good opportunity both to measure and to optimize search automatically, right? So just to summarize, and first of all, thank you for sticking around. Using hypotheticals inspired by the Hyde architecture help us bridge the gap between spoken language or queried language and the actual document language. Personas adds a lot of capabilities, new modalities, and to kind of plug in the actual audience. And most importantly, it's 100% fully automated. Thank you. If you have any questions, now would be a good time.
All right, so there's going to be questions from the room and from those on the Zoom. And while I'm walking up the stairs, I'm going to start with a Zoom question from Deep. Is argmax open source?
Is argmax open source? argmax is a company. We have several open source libraries that we contribute to, but this specific service is not.
Thanks. Sure. Thanks for the talk. For building the personas, I'm not sure if I quite followed it. Was it like the user giving you information to build them, or was there another way you're building the actual persona?
So that's a great question. What we end up doing is actually giving the user the ability to create her own personas. So there are like two ways to go about that. One is to look at the data and what kind of modalities do I have, but the other is to let the PMs kind of ask what kind of user typically visit your website. Who are the high value users, right? I might have a lot of users and a lot of content, but I'm targeting, I don't know, people suffering from diabetes. These are high value customers, and these are the search results that I want to measure. With persona-based simulation, we can actually target them, both by selecting the set of items from the catalog that we care about, and also kind of tailoring the specific personas. Does that answer your question?
Alexandra asks, are you familiar with any production systems that use this approach?
So that's a good question. We do have several clients who implemented our system in production, and that's working pretty well. I guess that if there are any other production systems, we don't necessarily know about it, right? Essentially, it's a testing technique, right? You can test, even if you use like out-of-the-box OpenSearch or Elasticsearch, Pinecone, just to name a few, you can test it with persona-based simulation, right? So it's not necessarily need to be real-time production-ready technique.
Yeah, I have a question. Like, you shared about evaluating personas offline, like measuring precision at K or something of that sort. But how do you even create judgment set, or basically what do you evaluate those on the basis of?
Another great question. So it's actually pretty pretty simple. If we have a persona that is thinking about a specific item, item number 46, she came up with a query, I can actually measure, did the result set contain item number 46? Right? So it's pretty easy to explain, it's pretty easy to generalize, and also to automate. If tomorrow the catalog changes and I get, I don't know, a bulk update with a lot more items, I don't need a human being to kind of annotate and write queries. We can actually do it like on an ongoing basis. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but basically, how do you even detect intent from online data and use it in evaluation is what I mean. Like, for example, customer might type yellow eyes, but how do you detect that the actual intent would be to search for John Days?
So that's a good question. We're not actually clairvoyant, so we don't know exactly what people think about, but we're trying to cover that specific use case in which we have an item that answers the user's question, and we're trying to measure for that. For example, if a user is interested, I don't know, in dermatology, and my hospital does not have a dermatologist, tough luck, right? It might be his or her intent, but I have nothing in my catalog to offer her. So we're only trying to measure on items that we can actually serve.
And in a related note, Kauzik asks, I might have missed this, but how does personas associate with the earlier issue about measuring search relevance while keeping in mind business goals, like revenue?
So that's a great question. I think that while as a search system is trying to kind of cater a wide audience, typically we have some users which are more important revenue-wise than others, right? So some services are more expensive, and trying to measure like that without some sort of persona-based simulation is really tricky, because I might have catered users with some of my high-value items, but it's not relevant, and I might have missed others. So if I know in advance what are my simulated users, my personas, care about, and some of them might care about, I don't know, expensive treatments or expensive items, I can simulate them. I can measure my search systems against that specific segment, and then I can actually communicate that to the business owners. Unlike looking at like generic out-of-the-box metrics like NDCG, which I don't know if you've gotten the chance to kind of explain what is NDCG to any PM, but it's tricky, right? It's one of those concepts that you might have worked, I don't know, for a few months and improved NDCG by 1%. Not necessarily it would improve the revenue. But if you kind of cater the personas that are more valuable to the organization, you're more likely to actually impact the bottom line. So I hope that kind of answered the question.
And I will now ask everyone on the Zoom, if you've typed a question and it hasn't been answered yet, type it again, please, because my entire chat window just crashed out and it's now blank.
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So now coming in, anybody else? There we go. Bertrand, come halfway. Huh?
Thank you, Yuri, for a great presentation. I wanted to go back to the hide indexing pipeline. Could you explain a little bit more how this works? Like, it looks like you're indexing questions, not the documents, but then these questions somehow point back to the documents. And how does that work at search time, this whole architecture? Thank you.
So that's actually a great question that I didn't cover. So if you go back to the hide indexing, the main idea is as follows. First of all, each question is associated to a specific item. And now this is being done in index time. On query time, I'm going to get several questions that some of them point to the same document. So essentially, I get kind of re-ranking out of the box. What we usually do is we plug in a Bayesian model on query time, in which we re-rank the items based on the amount of questions that pointed to the same article or the same item in the catalog. So it actually solves also kind of solves for re-ranking.
And Deep asks, what specific techniques or safeguards do you use to prevent LLMs from hallucinating unrealistic user intents or introducing bias when simulating personas?
So that's a great question. Actually, in the Hyde paper, they addressed this concern. And again, you should definitely read the paper, but one of the things that they highlighted in the paper is that even if the questions are widely hallucinated, their embedding is roughly in the same region as the real questions. And that's actually helpful. So since we are not using the question per se, right, we not necessarily show the generated questions to the user, it is very helpful to see that the same questions that might be inaccurate actually cluster around the relevant question. And that's actually, in the Hyde context, it's actually a feature and not a bug.
Brian asks, is LLM cost a consideration when running these simulations at scale?
So that's a great question. So is LLM cost a consideration? It is. But I guess in most cases, like I never seen even a single case where the LLM cost was higher than running a real experiment. So if you think about the opportunity cost of running a real online experiment, 50% of your users are going to get a variant that is suboptimal. So there's a huge cost associated with that. So whether it's worth or not the LLM cost, it kind of, I guess it depends on a case-by-case basis. And with our clientele, it's always a no-brainer.
David asks, what if you have a few dozen good answers for a given query, like 50 different pain relievers?
So that's a great question that I kind of addressed earlier. So let's assume that I have several good questions, all of them pointing to the same item. This is a good opportunity to plug our Bayesian model, like naive Bayes or something like that, and rank that specific item better, so higher. So having several good questions that are closely related to the user intent is actually a good thing.
And Jessica asks, can you expand a bit on using data to build a persona? Give some examples of data we should use in the process of using an LLM for it.
So that's a great question. Should we use data to define our prompts and to build the best persona? So we usually kind of throw the persona design and engineering right back at our customers. So they usually define what are the high value potential users and what clients actually care about. And it's not necessarily being reflected in the data. For example, we had a client who's actually trying to change user behavior in her website. Meaning that if we were to train a model from the data, from actual real user data, it's not the result that they're aiming for. So we do not necessarily want to use data to train our personas. We sometimes want to validate our personas against data. I hope that makes sense.
Are there any other questions?
Should I scream out loud?
No, you should participate in the microphone activity. You all come too. I was just giving Bertrand a hard time.
Thank you very much for the great talk. If I understand you correctly, you propose to replace online controlled experiments with these offline controlled experiments. And I'm wondering, so the power of online controlled experiments is that you get to real users, right? Uncovering stuff that you don't assume or know about them. You can measure like UI changes that sometimes have huge impact to the way search is exercised and performs. And I'm just wondering, how do you see this coming? Is this like an additional tool in the tool set of evaluation of features, or does this replace anything in your mind?
So I guess that replace is kind of a strong word. Most of our clients have like a huge backlog of experiments they want to do. Some of them in optimizing for search, some of them optimizing for other things. And I haven't met a single client that didn't ask me, hey, can you help us shorten experimentation time? So I think that's a tool to kind of reduce the load and to have less experiments running in parallel. And there's no replacement to actually testing UI changes and search changes on real users. The question is, how often should we actually do that? Does that answer your question?
While he ponders that, when applying this approach to an organization's internal knowledge base search, do you have any thoughts on how to best simulate organization-specific roles or personas using an LLM? This is from Brian.
So that's a good question, and I'm going to try to kind of wonder about, to kind of think out loud with you. Usually in marketing settings, we try to plug in some user characteristics like age, gender, location, background. I would guess that using a knowledge base, I would try to use roles and permissions from Active Directory and try to understand what is the user most likely to search. For example, if I know that the user is from the legal department, I have some context regarding what is that user more likely to be interested in. While if that user is from the IT department, maybe it could be helpful. So I personally would have kind of crafted or would try to align the personas with the org chart, right, regarding to departments or other consideration. I hope that makes sense.
So, in considering this approach, there's usually, or can frequently be, a pretty significant difference in opinions on what's relevant when you're talking about the wisdom of the crowd versus subject matter experts. And with an approach as you're outlining here, that works really well with wisdom of the crowd sort of approaches, where there really isn't a technically perfect response, or at least a best response that a subject matter expert would isolate and make clear. Can you kind of help me out on how you deal with the impedance mismatch between subject matter experts and just a random persona?
So that's a hard one, right? So even with, regardless of search, like, is that answer correct? Was that item relevant? And there's a lot of room for subjective judgment. So one could argue, for example, that while the question was generated from document A, actually document B is better suited to answer that question, right? So that's kind of a modeling potential error, and there isn't like a solution for that. We're trying to approximate what users think, and this is a very useful tool, but obviously both LLMs have their own inaccuracies, and not necessarily the data kind of agrees with that. So I guess that it's not a 100% bulletproof solution to optimize for what would a subject matter expert would say, but I think it's pretty good and cheap proxy to do that.
Thank you, Yuri. Let's all thank our speaker.